Good morning and welcome to Blackberry Abbey Conversations. I'm your host, Virginia Bowen,
And I'm Paul Wegler.
and we wanted to do a different segment today and just tell you a bit about who we are. And, well, in particular, Paul's going to tell you a bit about who he is and what has brought him to this point in his life.
Okay, well, trying to do something in 15 minutes for life history is a tiny challenge. My wife has written her story in about 200 or 300 pages, and I'm hoping if we can persuade her to get her on to see if she can do a 15-minute version of her story. But my story started out in December of 1946, a year after the end of World War II. And I have a cousin who just out of the blue sent me a birth announcement. It went to my uncle Eli, and he's died long since. But they were going through his papers, and it said, "Look what the stork brought. Name Paul, arrived December 7, 1946 at 12:45 a.m.
Oh, we got to show our viewers this. So this is what he's talking about, and then inside are the birth details, but quite a cute little piece.
Well, I had never seen this before. My mother thought I was born around 1 o'clock in the morning because she'd been out working the night before, and my guess is she never really got any sleep until I arrived.
Oh my goodness.
Probably not much after either.
I was gonna say that was the end of it.
Anyway, I grew up as the son of a Mennonite farmer in Ohio who grew vegetables, and I was the seventh of 9 children. And we lived a very rural, very old-fashioned lifestyle. And, well, we can talk more about that another time, how things have changed in the last 100 or 200 years. But at home, I spoke Pennsylvania Dutch before I learned English.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, well, I was part of the Pennsylvania Dutch culture, the Mennonite Amish culture.
Right, that would make sense.
But anyway, when I was 5 years old, I suddenly got switched out a bit because I was caught in a polio epidemic. And so I went to a hospital, and everybody there spoke English, and I didn't have any of my culture people around me.
Right.
And so that was the beginning of a world that I've lived in on and off most of my life. When I was 7, I went to a hospital in Warm Springs, Georgia, that Franklin Roosevelt had started because he had polio, and I spent 6 or 7 months there and only saw my parents every 2 weeks.
Oh my goodness.
So my life was a bit disrupted, but it actually turned out for the good because I got exposed to the broader culture early in my life.
I was gonna say that. I mean, looking back in retrospect, you can see how it became a big part of who you are today and how you succeeded in areas of your life. But as a 5-year-old, how did you manage with that? How did you deal with that?
Well, I was very sick when I was 5, and my parents there came much oftener. But I was probably too sick to know much of what was going
Right,
on.
to be cognitive. And,
Yeah. Although if I look back in my history, it's like the moment that I had that disease is when the light turned on in my memory. Everything was dim in my memory up till that moment. And since then, everything is pretty clear. It sort of was a wake-up call, unintentional, but since that time, I've had to think in order to survive.
Right. Well, isn't that fascinating? That's interesting.
So anyway, I grew up pretty much as a normal child, except I went to a religious Mennonite school with my brothers and sisters, walking about a mile across pastures to get to school, winter and summer, sometimes through
Uphill
snowdrifts.
both ways.
Yeah, and I did that up till grade 9, and then at grade 10, I went to a public high school and learned, sort of a normal small town education, but because I'd read lots of books, I did really well in school and got straight A's, and I got a scholarship to Harvard.
Had anybody else in your family been to Harvard?
No,
No.
nobody in my class went to school out of state, and over half of them didn't go to college or anything at all. In fact, about a third of them dropped out before the end of high school, which is pretty typical in my day.
Right, right.
No, I was a strange freak in terms of going that far away to Boston.
That is interesting. Yeah.
And when I got to Boston, I felt really disoriented because to be completely away from everybody I knew and to be around people that were not at all like the people I had grown up with was quite strange for a while. But within 3 or 4 months, I had fitted right in. I got active in school and things like debate, chess club, and swimming and various other things. And I actually enjoyed school.
Actually enjoyed. Well, I mean, isn't that the hope that you go there because you want to learn about something that tweaks your interest, right? But
Yeah.
not
Well, I
always
felt
the
like
case.
I'd skipped 6 grades to go from grade 12 to the first year at Harvard because it was that much more difficult. And I remember the first paper I got back was a D plus,
Oh
and
my!
and I don't remember ever getting a B pluses in my high school
Wow!
before.
Oh my goodness!
But the lecturer explained very patiently what I had done wrong and how I could correct it, and I can remember to this day exactly how he told me I need to write.
Hmm.
And I've never swayed away from that writing style.
Yeah, yeah. Interesting. And you're currently actually writing a book.
Yes, among other things. It's a little slow in getting done, but that's what, my writing is something. When I went to Harvard, I wanted to learn two things: how to write and how to speak. And so I took writing courses. I actually took an advanced level writing course, and I was on the debate team for a few years until I decided that I argued too much, and probably some of my friends told me that I did.
Oh.
So I decided to stop.
Like you brought it, you didn't just leave it at debate team. You
Yeah.
had to take it over to the pub with you.
Well, it's not hard for young people to argue
No, no, it can be a great source of amusement.
until I finally realized you don't persuade anybody by arguing with them.
No, no, you really don't. So
So, go ahead.
I had a thought, but it's gone now.
Well, anyway, after school, I was approached by several different employers. I won't go into the whole list, but I just went to interviews for people who came to interview at Harvard. And there was one employer that offered to send people overseas if they wanted to go overseas, which was the Chase Manhattan Bank. So, for no other reason, in my mind, I picked their offer, and 18 months later, I was in Frankfurt, Germany. And that started me off in a career in international banking, which I followed for 25 years.
But was it? Did it start off as an internship?
Well, it started off with an apprenticeship. They had a training school,
Yeah.
and I went through the training program. And at the end of it, they actually sent me to Germany to teach in their training program for all the young German
Okay.
people,
Okay. Oh, wow.
because I had done well enough in the program that they thought
Yes.
I could teach in it.
Wow. Well, that is very significant then. And you had already finished your schooling by this
Oh
point?
yeah, this was after I graduated.
Okay. Okay. Wow.
So I went back to New York. I had been briefly married to another Harvard graduate, and she didn't like Germany. And I thought, well, maybe if we went back to New York, it would work. But when we got back to New York, it turned out she wasn't all that committed to me, and she went her way and I went mine. So I decided to come out to the West Coast to Vancouver, and found a job out here, and have been here ever since.
Hmm. That would have been what year?
I came out in 1973 in October, and I can tell you the first month that I was out here, it rained 40 days and 40 nights.
No way.
Well, maybe it didn't, but it seemed like 40 days and 40 nights
Yeah. Well,
because the sun
quite
certainly
possibly.
didn't come out.
Yes. You were like, was this the right choice?
Anyway, she took one look at the weather and said that wasn't for her, and she abandoned ship.
Mm. Yeah, it's not for everybody, this West Coast life.
But anyway, the good news is a year later I met my current wife, Kathy, and in a few years we got married and had 4 children, and have enjoyed our life. I didn't stay in banking. Eventually, I moved out to work for some sizable companies. I became a chief financial officer of a pretty big company that had 15,000 employees, and later on I I became president of a smaller company that I took public on the stock exchange.
So it still stayed with numbers. That's always
Stayed with
been,
numbers and management, general management.
yeah.
So I had many things I did when I wasn't working. The list would take a long time. I played guitar and sang. I went camping with all our kids. Eventually, later on, I bought a boat, and a 36-foot boat, and we went out on the waters up and down the coast of British Columbia, which I'm told are about the most wonderful waters for boating that you can
I've
go
heard that.
to.
Yes, I've heard that.
So I developed many interests along the way, and
So were there any particularly low points where you felt at either like a disadvantage or like in a slump or some other aspect of like not feeling like you're moving ahead anymore?
oh yeah, absolutely. Every career has its ups and downs and fits and starts. It started out when I was a teenager and I wanted to get work, and because I was walking on crutches, it was very hard to find anybody who would employ me. But fortunately, my mother had a cousin who let me start. I started working for 35 cents an hour, working in a vegetable farm.
Oh goodness.
So on the road to riches.
Right.
Anyway, but in my jobs, I can remember the first time on Wall Street when I was working on a bunch of projects and I wanted to finish them all before I would take another one. And when my boss brought another file on, I said, "Well, I haven't finished the other things yet." And he said, "That's really silly." He said, "You're following the clean desk fallacy. You think that just because you have work on your desk, you shouldn't take on more."
Right.
And I've never forgotten that thought that you can always take on more even if you're working on things. So
So
you had asked the question whether I had ups and downs, and I said throughout my career I've had them.
yes.
And the higher I rose, the more pressure there was.
Yes, of course.
And in particular, I felt that at times people were asking me to do things that I didn't consider sort of as moral and ethical as I wanted to be. And at various times I wondered whether or not I should quit my jobs. And by that point in time, I was making rather high income and my family needed money to live. And I finally came upon a philosophy that if something got to the point where I absolutely couldn't go along with it, then I would quit. But I wouldn't I would ask the question, is this worth quitting about? And if the answer was no, then I would keep working. And later on, I realized that everybody in this world works under circumstances that they don't like and where they have to adapt to ways of doing things that are not their chosen way. But I also found that we have a lot of scope for doing things well in an environment where not everybody does.
How do you mean? What?
Well, that people would know if you were honest. People would know if you were respectful, if you were courteous, if you were friendly. And no matter what the organization behind you was, they would enjoy working with you if you were the right kind of person. And I managed to become fairly successful in the Vancouver market in banking because I had a very good high reputation that people would know that if they asked me something, I would not try to be shrewd. I'd try to be transparent and tell them what I thought of their situations.
What do you think what do you think are some markers to gauge whether, like, what are some, okay, I gotta reframe how to ask this question. I'll just cut out this part. But what are some necessary elements that everybody needs? What are some necessary elements that everybody needs in their work environment in order to be able to not quit and to not feel like they have to switch it up?
Well, I would say the minimum are just two. You need to get paid. You should never keep working when you're not getting paid. And I have seen a lot of people, friends and family, that have worked for a promise of pay that they never got. And so if you don't get paid, you shouldn't work.
Of course.
And the other one is if the organization that you work for is dishonest or evil, definitely you shouldn't carry on. Um, I always said I was often involved in selling things, and I could not in good conscience sell something to somebody that I didn't believe in. And I won't go through the list of things that I couldn't do in good conscience. But fortunately, in my career, I was able to provide services that people wanted and that would help them.
Okay, so what about when you're in a work environment where you don't feel respected and where you don't feel that you're being fairly, treated, whether it's time off or if it's the clientele that you're working with, like things like that.
Well, everybody gets the boss from hell sooner or later, and I got mine on Wall Street in my first permanent assignment. And somehow or another, I had the good sense to just stay quiet and do my work and not offend this man. His name was Frank Brennan. I'm sure he's no longer alive. And I amazingly survived. And when I had decided to leave that bank, the people who knew Frank Brennan said, "Boy, you better be prepared for the worst. When you tell him that you're going to quit, he'll give you less than an hour to clean out your desk." Well, amazingly, he threw a goodbye party for me and gave me a silver pen. And apparently, he had never done this before. So you can work for the boss from hell.
What if you don't feel like you're moving, advancing, or progressing and building your career? What if you feel stagnant?
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's two or three sides to that. The first one is you have to earn the right to move up. And I know most of the people I know would like to move up, but most of the people that I know are not prepared to do the work and the time and the effort and the learning that it makes them deserving. But the other factor is time. I've found that you have to do good work for 2 or 3 years before it's widely recognized, and then you move up. That anybody who thinks if I do good work today, tomorrow they'll bump me up, it isn't being realistic.
Do you think there's any point where, like, say you've been at a company for 10 years or 15 years or whatever, and you've never really seen
there are situations like when I was working in banking in Vancouver, I hit a ceiling because all the really good jobs were at the head office level or at the regional level, and I was out in the whatever, and that's just a fact of life. So I had to choose between staying in Vancouver, which my wife and children wanted to do, or accept the level that I had reached.
Right.
But that's really why I left the banking world to become a chief financial officer. I was able to get outside of that world, and my salary doubled.
That's all.
Well, I mean, I won't say that I had a charmed life. We've talked about many things, like building up relationships. That I learned much of my theory of managing relationships from the business world. And in fact, in business, they talk about relationship management, where if you're a service provider and you have clients, how do you manage that relationship so that it will progress?
Yes, of course. Well, and this has also been what's inspired a lot of the topics in your book as well, right?
Yeah, very much so. Applying them to more generally in life.
Right.
And that we need to be able to respond both to good treatment and ill treatment.
Right.
I've been talking to my sister about somebody who's treated her bad and telling her why she shouldn't respond by treating that person bad. But it never gets you ahead. Just because somebody treats you bad, if you treat them bad in response, it invariably just becomes a huge quarrel.
Yeah. Well, everybody starts digging their heels in.
Shouting match, legal contests, and whatever. Those should be avoided like the plague.
Why do you think that you had the stickability of sticking with things, or like you say, keeping your mouth shut, or any number of tactics you use to to be able to come to this point in your life. Well, not even this point, but just kind of develop a general response to
Well,
life adversities and
li-
conflicts.
like most people, I learned by trial and error. After I shot my mouth off often enough and saw that that didn't get me anywhere, I tried the alternative and learned that it would often, and to this day, if I have a person I know who's doing something that I think is completely wrong, that doesn't give me a license to go tell them that they're doing everything wrong.
Oh
If
yeah.
they ask me honestly how they should approach this, I would give them a clue or two, but I would never come at somebody and say, "You're doing this really bad," and am I going to tell you?
Well, that's a pretty common approach. That I mean, that's a that's like a very commonly seen thing. Like
Yeah.
amongst
Oh,
friendships and
yeah.
amongst like in
Sure.
the workplace, like
Absolutely,
everywhere.
and it destroys a relationship in minutes.
Yes, yes, that's true
Anyway,
too.
going back to my story, which isn't over because I'm 71 and I hope to make it at least to 72
Yeah.
and maybe 92 or 95 or 97 like my parents did.
Hmm.
But I'm happily retired with my wife on the coast of British Columbia. We're only about an hour and a half from the center of Vancouver, which is one of the nicest cities in the world. But where I live, it's very pleasant and peaceful, and I get to grow vegetables like my father and mother did.
You've probably seen some of the vegetables that he's grown in our intro. So you have things like beets, you've got tomatoes and cabbage and broccoli,
And kale and
kale.
every kind of spice in the spice cupboard. I walk out the door and get all the spices I need for every pot.
Mm.
I've learned spices are quite interchangeable, and in the best cookbooks they'll say, "Well, if you don't have, uh, sage, then try another thing." So, but I do have. I looked at a cookbook that said the top 12 spices, and I think I had 8 or 9, and the top 24, I think I had over 15 of them growing right outside my door.
Hmm.
So,
It's pretty beautiful.
yeah, it makes food fun. And we have a big place with a swimming pool, and tons of people come to visit. As you know, this weekend we'll have a kindergarten garden swimming party that your oldest son is involved with, and we'll have another former tenant in our house with his 2 sons coming to visit, plus our friend Harold, and then a couple of other people are coming for dinner. So
Well, it's a community, right?
yeah, it's lovely. So what I would propose is in another conversation to talk a little bit about all the changes that both of us have witnessed in our lifetime of how the world has been changing. My parents grew up just after the year 1900, and from their stories and my own experiences, the world has changed so much in the last 100 or 110 years that it's worth talking about. So I won't go into all of that right now, but I would like some time to talk about some of those changes.
Absolutely. I think it's so important to be able to understand from where we've come and what has changed and progressed and to give a wider scope of understanding what's going on in our world today and even appreciating, where we at in history today, right?
Yeah. Anyway, that's plenty of stuff for another day.
Right.
But I hope I didn't leave out too much in my story about where I've come from.
Well, there's definitely a better picture of who you are and what you've gone through and how that's influenced your whole prerogative today, I guess. Not prerogative, but your whole outlook.
Yeah, I didn't mention when I said that I grew up speaking Pennsylvania Dutch. I've later found out that people who grow up in a two-language home, whether it's French and English or Spanish and English or Chinese and English, have an amazing capacity to learn additional languages.
Oh yes.
So that really served me well.
Absolutely. Yes. I wish that I'd had that advantage. I mean, I speak a little bit of German, but I've never spoken it much at home because I feel like I would just teach them how to mispronounce
Yeah.
words. And,
Well, people in Asia and people in Europe just grow up normally speaking many languages. They have to. And North America is one of the few places where you can get by speaking one language.
well,
Well, anyway, thanks for listening, and we'll be back again hopefully next week.
yeah. Thank you so much for watching.
Bye.